I was 68 years old the day the anchorage learned what my dog was, and I wanted on record that I didn't raise my voice once. That matters to me. People hear the story now and they put trumpets in it. They have the Orsai screaming, which is true, and they have the great doors buckling, which is also true, but they put a sword in my hand and fire in Gus's eyes, and that part is a lie. There was no fire. There was an old man on a folding stool and a gray-muzzled German shepherd lying across his boots, and there was a thing in the dark that the whole station had built its courage around forgetting. That's the whole inventory. I'd ask you to remember it. Seth Anchorage was a deep station, Orsai built, hung in the cold between two dead suns where nobody had any reason to be, except that the Orsai had decided long ago that this was a good place to keep what they didn't want loose anywhere warmer. I came aboard as a contractor. The polite word was fauna liaison. The true word was that I cleaned cages and kept my mouth shut and drew a wage doing it, because a man my age with my knees doesn't get to be choosy about where the work is. I've been a handler my whole life, 40 years near enough with the working dogs first on Earth, then out, wherever the contracts ran. I'd buried more good dogs than I care to count, and I'd trained the ones that buried me a little each time they went. Gus was the last of them. He was 11 when we shipped to Seth, which is old for a shepherd, old enough that the gray had come up over his muzzle and crept back toward his eyes, and he'd slowed in the hindquarters the way they do. He slept more than he used to. He'd earned it. The Orsai thought he was a joke. I want to be fair to them, because later they were fair to me, and the fairness cost them something. But in the beginning they looked at Gus the way you'd look at a piece of furniture someone had hauled a long way for no reason. The Orsai are tall, taller than a man by a head and more, with that long backward-jointed stride and the gray hide that goes darker at the joints, and faces that don't do much that a human reads as expression. They keep beasts. Their whole status runs on it. An Orsai of rank is measured by the lethality of the thing that walks at his heel, and they breed those things careful and cruel. And they were not impressed by a stiff old dog who had to be helped up onto the loading dock by a man with a bad back. There was one in particular, Keeper of Rows, his title translated to, though the crew called him Vesh. He ran the pens. He was good at it the way a man can be good at something terrible, competent, unhurried, never once unkind to the animals and never once warm to them either. The first week, he watched me settle Gus on a mat outside the liaison office, and he came over and stood there with his hands folded the way they do, and he looked down a long time. "This is your beast," he said. It wasn't a question. The Orsai don't ask much. "This is my dog," I said. "It is old." "So am I." "It has no armor, no spur, no crest." He crouched slow, careful, the way you'd crouch to read a label, and he looked at Gus's flat gray face, his soft ears, the white coming in around his jaw. Gus looked back at him and did the thing he did, which was nothing. He didn't growl. He didn't stiffen. He just held the look, calm and level and patient, the way an old dog holds a look when he's deciding whether you're worth getting up for. Then he blinked slow and put his chin back down on his paws. Vesh stood up. "It is decorative," he said, and there was no cruelty in it. He genuinely believed he'd assessed the animal. "On Seth we do not keep decorative beasts, but you are a contractor. You may keep yours." "Appreciate it," I said. He didn't catch the dryness. They mostly didn't. I should tell you about the rows, because the rows are the heart of it, and because the dread of them was a real thing. I lived inside for 2 months before any of this happened. The quiet rows were the deepest part of the station, down where the gravity got strange and the air carried that mineral cold that gets into your teeth. That was where the Orsai kept the beasts that even they were afraid of, the failed breeds, the ones too dangerous to walk at any heel, the ones they couldn't sell and wouldn't kill because killing them felt, to the Orsai, like admitting something. And at the very bottom of the rows, behind doors that took 3 keepers and a council seal to open, they kept the Vorum. I never saw it in those first 2 months. Almost nobody had. But I heard it talked about, in the low, careful way the crew talked about it, and I pieced the shape of it together the way you piece together a thing from how people's faces change when it comes up. The Vorum was their apex, Not a war beast walks at a heel, takes a command, knows a master. The Vorum took no master. The Orsai had bred it, somewhere far back, for a purpose they'd since lost the stomach for, and what they'd made was a thing that did not stop. It did not hunt the way a predator hunts, with a target and an end. It cleared. It went down a row, and when it had gone down a row, the row was empty, and it kept going, patient and total, the way water finds the bottom of a thing. That was why they called the lowest level the quiet rows, because that was where the quiet got made. They fed it. They kept it sealed. They told themselves it was contained, and they built a kind of courage on top of that telling, the way you'll build a floor over a hole, and after a while forget the hole is under there at all. The crew walked the upper rows and joked and did their work and stepped over the floor they'd built without thinking about what it was built over. I thought about it. I'd handled enough dangerous animals to know the difference between a thing that's contained and a thing that hasn't gotten out yet. Those are not the same thing. People who keep predators learn that difference, or they don't keep them long. Gus knew about the rows before I did, in the way dogs know. The first time I took him down to the second level on my rounds, he stopped at the head of the ramp and would not go down. He didn't bark. He didn't shy. He just stopped and set his weight back and looked down that ramp into the cold with his ears forward and his whole old body gone still and serious in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not afraid. I want to be clear, never afraid, but attentive. The way he'd go still over a scent that mattered when he was young, and we still did real work. He stood there a long moment reading the dark. Then he looked up at me, and then he went down the ramp at my heel, slow, deliberate. And he stayed close the whole round, and he watched the sealed doors at the bottom every second we were near them. I told Vesh about it later, because it seemed like the kind of thing a keeper of rows should know. "My dog doesn't like your bottom doors," I said. Vesh did the small head tilt that was the closest his face came to amusement. "Your decorative beast is wise to fear the Vorum," he said. "All beasts fear it. It is the apex of this station. Yours senses what it is." "That's not fear," I said. "It is fear," Vesh said, kindly certain, and went back to his work. I let it go. You can't argue an animal into a man who's already decided what the animal is. I'd spent 40 years failing to do exactly that. So I let it go, and I did my rounds, and Gus slept on his mat outside the office and got helped up onto the dock and held the long calm looks the Orsai gave him and gave them nothing back, and the floor stayed over the hole, and 2 months went by like that. Then the floor came up. I don't know to this day exactly what failed. The Orsai investigation said a seal degraded. The crew rumor said a young keeper opened a door he'd been told never to open, to prove to someone he wasn't afraid. Both might be true. It doesn't matter much. What matters is that on a shift like any other shift, with me on my folding stool outside the office drinking the gray Orsai approximation of coffee and Gus asleep across my boots, the station alarm came on. I'd never heard it before. It wasn't loud, which was the worst thing about it. It was a low, even tone, almost gentle, repeating, and the moment it started every Orsai I could see went rigid. Vesh came up the corridor at a dead run, which I had not known the Orsai could do, that long backward stride eating the floor, and behind him the crew was already moving, already streaming up toward the lifts, and their faces, I'd learned to read a little by then, their faces had gone to a thing past panic, a kind of total animal certainty. The look of creatures who have lived their whole lives over a hole and have just felt the floor go. "It is loose," Vesh said as he passed. He didn't stop. I'll never hold that against him. There's no shame in running from the Vorum. It's the only sane thing to do. But he stopped 3 steps on and turned and looked at me still sitting on my stool, and he said, "Old man, up to the lifts. It clears from the bottom. It is coming." "Coming where?" "Everywhere," he said. "That is what it does, up." And then he was gone with the rest of them, up, and the corridor emptied, and the gentle alarm went on repeating, and I sat there on my folding stool with my cooling cup and my old dog, and I did the math an old handler does. I was 68. My knees were bad. The lifts were 400 meters up a corridor that the whole station was draining into, and even if I made it, I'd be standing in a crush of 2-meter aliens, all certain they were about to die. And the thing came up from the bottom, patient and total, and it cleared. And there is no running from a thing that clears. There is only being higher up the list when it arrives. And Gus had woken up. He hadn't startled. He just opened his eyes the way he did, and lifted his gray head off my boots, and he was looking down the corridor toward the ramp that led to the rows, ears forward, that old serious stillness coming over him, the one I'd seen at the head of the ramp 2 months back. He got up. He didn't need help. That's the thing I remember, that for once he got up smooth and easy without the hitch in the hindquarters, like the years had stepped back off him for a minute. He stood square in the middle of the corridor facing the dark, and his hackles weren't up, and his lip wasn't lifted, and he was the calmest thing on that whole screaming station. I knew that calm. I'd known it for 11 years and in other dogs before him for 30 years before that. It is not the calm of an animal that doesn't understand the danger. It is the calm of an animal that understands the danger completely and has measured itself against it and come out the far side of the measuring. I had seen Gus afraid of the vacuum cleaner when he was a pup, of a particular tone the station's hull made in the cold. This was not that. There was no fear in him anywhere. He had read the thing coming up out of the rows, and he had weighed it, and he had decided. So I made my decision the way I'd made every real decision of my life, which was to trust the dog. I got up off my stool. It took me a moment. My decisions are smoother than my knees. I set down the cup. And I walked down the corridor toward the ramp, toward the dark, toward the thing that emptied pens, with my old gray shepherd at my heel matching my slow pace exactly the way he'd done it 10,000 times. And behind us the last of the Orsai were going up, and we were the only two things on Seth Anchorage going down. I won't pretend I wasn't afraid. I'm telling you Gus wasn't. Me, I was an old man walking toward the worst thing a cruel and ancient people had ever bred, and my heart was going like a hammer and my mouth was dry as the cold. But I'd learned a long time ago that the handler's fear doesn't matter to the work. The dog reads your hands and your voice and the set of your shoulders, not the racket in your chest. So I kept my hands easy and my shoulders down, and I walked. We came to the head of the ramp, and there, for the first time, I saw it. I'm not going to describe it the way the storytellers do. They make it a monster, all teeth and scale, and that's wrong, and the wrongness matters. The Vorum wasn't built to frighten. It was built to clear, and a thing built to clear doesn't need to be terrible to look at. It came up the ramp out of the cold and the dark, low and wide and pale, moving without hurry, moving the way the tide moves, and the worst thing about it was exactly that lack of hurry. It had all the time there was. It had never once in its existence needed to rush, because nothing it went toward got away. It came up the ramp and the gentle alarm went on and the cold came off it like a draft from an open door, and it filled the bottom of the corridor, and it was looking, if that was looking, at the two of us standing at the top. I stopped. Gus didn't. He stepped out ahead of me, one step, two. Out in front, between me and the thing, and he stood there square and low and absolutely still, and he looked down the ramp at the Vorum with that long, level, patient gaze. The same gaze he'd given Vesh. The same gaze he'd given every alien who decided he was decorative. The gaze of an old animal deciding whether you were worth getting up for, except he was already up, and the deciding was done. And what was in him now was simple and total and older than the Orsai, and older than their breeding pens, and older, I think, than the cold between the dead suns. It was the thing that's in the floor of every working dog under all the gentleness, the thing you spend a career hopping you never have to see and knowing is there. He stood between me and the apex of that station, and he told it, without a sound, without a snarl, without lifting his lip off one tooth. Exactly what he was. And the Vorum stopped. It stopped on the ramp. The tide stopped coming in, and I watched a thing that had never in its life met a floor it didn't go through come up against my old gray dog's calm and find a floor. I'd like to tell you I understood it. I didn't not then, not the mechanism of it. I've had years to think since, and the closest I've come is this. The Vorum took no master because it had never met an apex. The Orsai had bred out its fear of them. That was the whole grim genius of it. But you cannot breed out of an animal the thing that lies down before something older and surer than itself, because that thing isn't fear. It's recognition. It's the oldest law there is, under all the cruelty and all the breeding. The law that says when the apex stands in the road, you stop. The Orsai had never been the apex. They'd only ever been afraid. And the Vorum, who had never in its life met a thing that wasn't afraid of it, came up out of the quiet rows and met an old dog who simply wasn't, and the floor it had gone through its whole existence turned out to have a bottom after all, and the bottom was named Gus. I said the only thing there was to say. I said it low, the way I'd said it 10,000 times, on training fields and loading docks and the long dark watches of 100 jobs. The word that meant the work is mine now. Stand down, I have it. Easy, I told him. I want to be careful about what came next, because this is the part the storytellers turn into a battle, and it was not a battle. I am an old man and my eyes are not what they were, and I'll tell you honestly I closed them. I'd handled dangerous animals my whole life, and one thing you learn is that there are moments that belong to the animal and not to you, and you do not watch them to satisfy your curiosity. You give the animal its privacy, and you trust the work. So I closed my eyes at the top of that ramp with my hand down at my side where Gus could find it if he wanted it, and I listened. I heard the gentle alarm. I heard the cold draft off the thing on the ramp. I heard, very faint, the station above us full of fled creatures. And then I heard a sound I will carry to my own quiet, a long, low, settling sound, the sound a very large thing makes when it lies down, not a death. I want that absolutely clear because the storytellers get it wrong, and the wrongness is an insult to my dog. Gus didn't kill it. He never touched it. There was no blood on that ramp, not a drop, not ever. The Vorum lay down. The thing that emptied pens came up out of the quiet rows to clear the station, and met the apex it had been bred never to fear, and did the one thing the Orsai had spent generations certain it could not do, which was recognize that it was not, after all, the oldest thing in the room, and it lowered itself down onto the cold floor of the ramp. And it was still, and it was quiet, the way everything around it had always been made quiet, except that this time the quiet was its own. I opened my eyes. Gus was sitting. Just sitting, square and easy, the gray old shepherd, ears soft now, the seriousness gone out of him, looking back over his shoulder at me with his tongue out and that mild, pleased expression a dog gets when the work's done and he knows it went well. The Vorum lay below him on the ramp, vast and pale and motionless, and it did not rise, and it never rose again while I was on Seth, and the cold draft off it had gone still. Good, I told him, my voice didn't shake much. Good, Gus. He came back to my heel. The Orsai found us like that maybe an hour on, when enough of them had recovered enough nerve to come back down with their cutting poles and their containment crews. Found an old human sitting on the cold floor at the head of the ramp, with his back against the wall and his bad knees out in front of him, and a gray dog asleep across his boots, and the apex of their station lying quiet below them in a posture none of them had ever seen it take. The posture of a beast that has met its better and made its peace with the meeting. Vesh was at the front. He stood a long time at the top of the ramp, looking down at the Vorum, and then he looked at me, and then he looked at Gus, who opened one eye, held the keeper's gaze the calm way he held all of them, and went back to sleep across my boots. I watched it happen on Vesh's face. I'd gotten good at reading them by then. I watched 2 months of certainty go out of him, and I watched the floor come up under him too. The understanding that he had crouched down a long way to read the wrong label, that the apex of Seth Anchorage had been lying outside his liaison office the whole time, getting helped up onto the loading dock by a man with a bad back, and that he, keeper of rows, had called it decorative. He crouched down again, slow, careful, The way you'd crouch to read a label you'd gotten badly wrong the first time. He looked at my sleeping dog a long while. "This is your beast," he said. It still wasn't a question, but everything under it was different. "This is my dog," I said. He was quiet a moment. Then he said the thing I think cost the Orsai the most to say, the admission their whole status had been built so as never to have to make. "We did not have a word for what it is," he said. "We have words for every beast. We did not have one for this." "He's a German shepherd," I said. "We've had them a long time. We mostly use them to find people, to bring back the ones who get lost." Vesh looked down at the Vorim, lying quiet on the ramp where nothing had ever lain quiet of its own will. "To bring back the ones who get lost," he repeated, slow, and I don't think he was talking about my dog anymore. I retired off Seth not long after. My knees made the decision and I let them. The Orsai wanted Gus to stay, wanted to study him, wanted to breed from him, wanted, in the end, to understand the law he'd shown them at the head of that ramp, the law their cruelty had bred them right out of remembering. I told them no. You don't lend out a thing like that. They took it better than I expected. The last thing Vesh did when we left was come down to the dock, the same dock, and watch me help my old dog up into the shuttle, the hitch back in his hindquarters now. The years come back onto him, just a gray old shepherd again who needed a hand getting up. Vesh watched the whole undignified business of it. He didn't say it was decorative. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "On Seth we measure rank by the beast that walks at the heel." "I know," I said, "you told me." "I am trying to say," he said, with what I think was great difficulty for him, "that I do not think we have been measuring it correctly." I got Gus settled. I got myself settled, which took longer. And as the doors came down, I gave the old keeper the only thing I had that was worth giving, which was the truth, dry and plain. The way I'd say it to anyone who'd spent 2 months calling my dog furniture. "He's not the one who walks at my heel," I said. "I walk at his." Gus was already asleep by the time we cleared the anchorage. He didn't wake for the cold of it. He'd done his work. He'd earned the rest. He slept across my boots all the way out, gray and ordinary and breathing slow, the apex of a station that had spent its whole history afraid of the wrong thing, and I sat there with my hand down where he could find it, and I let him sleep.